She got to Chicago, looked for an apartment, and was intelligent enough to look for a roommate. And she found a young girl named Doris, who became her lifelong friend. They got an apartment, and they both were experienced with food service. And so they went out and got a job at the same place, a restaurant, as waitresses and cooks, and then went to the university and enrolled. They both were taking different avenues of education, but Carol's was in teaching. And after living like this for about 3 years, another point of history came up, and that was we gained 2 more states, one of them being Alaska. It was a boom to the Alaska economy and to everything there. And all of the GIs coming home had children and were getting of the age they needed to go to school. And all of the facilities in Alaska were still pretty primitive and far between. So they had to make do with what they had to accommodate this boom. I think that's where the term boomers came from. Carol signed up to teach school in Alaska. Now, she only had 3 years of college under her belt. She didn't have a teaching certificate, but they didn't care. It was an emergency situation, and the leaders of the new state of Alaska agreed we'll make do with what we can get. So Carol went to Alaska and taught school with all of these baby boomers. She was there about 3 years, and then things started to catch up. They started building schoolhouses to accommodate them and getting fully credentialed teachers. And so Carol went back to Chicago and enrolled once again in college. Carol never got her 4-year degree. She went on eventually to get a master's degree in child education. And for the first time in her life, she got to wear a cap and gown. She didn't get a high school one, she didn't get her 4-year degree, but she got a master's. That's the kind of character she was. One of her first jobs teaching was in what they called the projects in Chicago. Now, these were the neighborhoods where the minorities lived, where the lesser housing was, and so forth. I don't know how else to describe it. But it wasn't really the dream place for a teacher to go. Carol had taken Spanish as a language in college, and there was a Puerto Rican section of Chicago where there was a big uproar and turmoil going on, and the white supremacists were trying to burn down the schools and keep the teachers out and so forth. So all the while she taught there, she and the other teachers that were in that area were taken to school by a police car, Chicago police. 2 patrolmen in a car would pick up 2 teachers, each of the patrol cars, and walk them right up to the door to get them in there safely. And then same thing to pick them up in the afternoon when school was out and take them home again. had the opportunity to see that. My parents took a vacation and went to Chicago, and we shared the experience of seeing where she taught and so forth. Carol made us all agree not to tell her father exactly how she was living and where she was teaching, other than just tell him where I'm teaching. He would have worried too much about his daughter. And so it remained a secret. She went on teaching school in Chicago and became known as a good teacher. And with our other experiences, she got to know Mayor Daley. We've all heard of the Daley family, and Mayor Daley was, in her eyes, was a great man. Not everybody agreed to that, of course. He was a politician. But part of his program to be elected, he had decided to fix the daycare problem. There were no daycare centers, and if there were any, they weren't any good. He wanted it to be fixed up and to be a good program, and he needed a good person knowing education for children, and that was Carol. She worked for Mayor Daley directly from his office and found the buildings, or had buildings built. They found proper people to run them, operate them, good people. And it was a full-time job for her, and she was in charge of that. So she was still in the teaching field, but not teaching directly, but serving a good purpose. Carol lived her whole life in Chicago. I was always close to her. I was her only nephew. And she was an anomaly, I guess you'd call it. She could talk sports. I've always loved football. And when we got together, a couple of times a year, she'd come home and we'd talk. She'd talk about the Chicago Bears and I'd talk about the Minnesota Vikings. She knew what she was talking about. She could talk baseball, any sports. She was well-read and well-traveled and an interesting person. Somebody once asked me at a party, what was my favorite Christmas present? And I didn't have to think long, but when it came around to my turn to tell what my favorite present was, I said, anything I got from my Aunt Carol. She must have spent a small fortune on Christmas. To me, I always got something that was an educational toy, but something fun. I remember the Christmas I got a chemistry set from her. I and my buddy, who were maybe 10 or 12 years old, played with that chemistry set, making disappearing ink and skunk odors and all sorts of things. And that was the kind of presents that she gave. She was also very giving to her father. She bought him his first television set. He never intended to have one, but she bought him one for Christmas one year. And I know because I had to help hook it up. And one year, because he was known to be an amateur naturalist with wildlife and so forth, for Christmas, I remember she bought him a canary. She came with the cage wrapped and all of the bird seed and all the things with it. And he opened that up, and then she brought in the bird, a little yellow canary. That little bird, first of all, I remember his name was Dickie. I'm not sure why, but that's what he named him. That little bird, whenever he went to Grandpa's house, would be on his shoulder. At night, he said he put him in his cage and put a blanket over the cage for him. But during the day, Grandpa walked around his house with this bird on his shoulder. That's the kind of gift giver Aunt Carol was.